I really never should begin a sermon with reinforcing binary thinking, but I can't help but feel like there are two kinds of people, those who grew up going to camp, sleepaway camp, and those who did not. Raise your hand if you grew up going away to camp. So if you did not, that's okay. We can have the camp experience together at the annual congregational retreat at the mountain this April. So then you will have been to camp if you go to the annual retreat this April. As for me, I don't think I would be here. Don't think I would be a minister today without Girl Scout camp. At age 11, I was sent to Camp Wild Rose. I believe that was in Middle Illinois. And the camp itself was nothing special. There were no horses, no lake, I don't think, in my memory. Only endless time for games, bonding, and singing together late into the night. It was my first time away from home, and I felt bold and outgoing. Something happened that week that has always stuck with me. One evening, in the middle of the week, we had a clear, moonless night, only the jeweled net of stars twinkling high above us. The counselors took us out on a high-stakes night hike. At one point, we were instructed to put our flashlights in a counselor's bag. "We are doing a trust walk," she said. Now, I'm not sure how good the liability insurance was for this camp. But as hikes go, this was fairly treacherous. The path was rocky. It felt like we were high above sea level. At one point, the path curved around the edge of a small mountain. At another point, we had to cross a creek. All we had were the hands of the girl and the hand of the girl in front of us, and her soft voice whispering to the person behind her, "Step up now. Step down now. Small jump now." I remember the complete disorientation. I realized it was easier to simply close my eyes. Closing my eyes sharpened my ears somehow, gave the feeling of the girl's hand in mine more weight. I could smell the water as much as I could hear the creek's gurgling flow. I have thought of that night often throughout my life, how exhilarating it felt to stop searching for light, just surrendering to the darkness, feeling our way forward into mystery. For 12 little girls, the night was full of power and daring, realizing the dark was so much more than just monsters under our beds, more than nothingness. Hand in hand, we walked right out of our childlike understanding of the night. And when we finally reached the end of our trust walk, after what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, we opened our eyes, dropped our hands, and whispered excitedly, "We made it through." Reverend James Forbes, a mentor of mine, reflects that since the election that brought in our current national leadership, there have been ominous signs on the horizon. Shortly after the election, a woman he knew met him on the street and she said, "Pastor, I believe these are the last days." Well, that captured his imagination. And so he decided to look more closely at how the Bible characterizes the last days. And I will tell you, he found some wisdom and resonance in 2 Timothy chapter 3. This is what the Bible has to say about the last days. "You must understand this, that in the last days distressing times will come. For people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, disobedient, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates, brutes, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure, holding to the outward form of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid these people. For among them are those who are always being instructed and can never arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Wise words for us in this moment. A lot of wisdom there. You know, something is happening when things get this bad. We hardly know what to do with all the criminality that is being affirmed in the highest offices in the land. We wonder, when will they figure out what to do? When will they figure out what to do? But there is some good news. When it gets as bad as it is now, given what is happening in Washington and beyond the Beltway, I am telling you, something else is going on. Michelle Goldberg wrote an op-ed for the Times just this past week. She thinks lately she is experiencing a phenomenon she calls democracy grief. She writes, "For anyone who was, like me, born after the civil rights movement finally made democracy in America real, liberal democracy has always been a part of the climate, as easy to take for granted as clean air or the changing of the seasons. When I contemplate the sort of illiberal oligarchy that would await my children should Donald Trump win another term, the scale of the loss feels so vast I can barely process it," she writes. Now, I have lived through what I believe are three of our nation's greatest tragedies. One was on September 11th, 2001. I remember exactly what I was doing that day, as I'm sure you do too. And then came December 14th, 2012, 6 years ago, just this week, the horrific mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School that killed 28 people, including 20 first graders. I know exactly where I was standing when I heard that news. And personally, I don't know about you, but I consider November 9th, 2016 to be one of the darkest days our nation has faced. I went to bed that night with a fever, coming down with the flu. All night, I woke many times to my spouse pacing the room, holding his phone, until finally the morning came and he was sitting on the bed, head in his hands. My fever spiked, and as he said the words that a reality television star had become the President of the United States of America, I was hit by a crash of nausea, then dozed fitfully, thinking it had all been a nightmare. It must have been a nightmare, until the fever broke the next day. And even then, I didn't know how dark things would become, how rapists would be vindicated in the highest court of the land, how immigrant children would be treated and left in cold cells to die alone of the flu. I didn't know then that Puerto Rico would be left to suffer in their storm in darkness for months, that each day's civic discourse would sink lower and lower, that the ice caps would literally melt, that the plastic would choke the reefs. And yes, it does seem like the end of days. Now, I have always been a sunny person, born in July, my favorite month. But for this season in our world, I knew no solar faith would be my lifeline for the long, dark night ahead. The sun, constant, persistently giving off heat, never a question, not hiding, just there. I've never been as sure as the sun in my faith. So sure about the nature of God that it's just there for me to find. A light breeze maybe to move a cloud out of the way, and voila, Now, the dark night of the soul means different things to different people. It can mean grief after the loss of a loved one. It can mean the loss of faith by circumstances or beyond control. But no one chooses the dark night. The dark night descends. And when it does, the reality that troubles the soul is often the apparent absence of meaning. And for some people, of God. If God is light, well, then God is gone. Or if truth is light, then truth is gone. And even if friends come around during the dark night of the soul, they are more often like the friends of Job, not much help. The only way out is through. Now, as we talk about this, I want to distinguish between a mental crisis and a crisis of faith. For some people, the way out may mean seeing a doctor and getting medical help for a mental disorder. Lunar spirituality waxes and wanes. It does not stay dark forever. And so I want to distinguish the difference between true mental struggle and this crisis of faith. Because the real question is whether you will resist the darkness or will you surrender to what can be discovered within in this spiritual crisis. The theologian Barbara Brown Taylor writes about John of the Cross, the person who wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. He was a 16th century monk, and he began his most significant, best-known work, The Dark Night of the Soul, during the 11 months he spent in a monastery prison. He was a Carmelite monk in the same order as Teresa of Avila, if you've ever heard of her. And like her, he believed in the ideals of a simple life spent in solitude and prayer. This made the two of them rebels of their time, believe it or not. Most of the nuns and even monks were going for more opulent living situations and expressions of faith. Teresa of Avila pressed on in spite of huge opposition to her work. She founded the monastery of St. Joseph of Avila in 1562. She prayed for a male ally who would help her to found more monasteries, and John of the Cross was the answer to her prayers. He became her apprentice and spiritual director for her convent. 3 years later, when John's superiors told him he must quit his job at the convent, he refused, becoming an outlaw to his own order. On December 2nd of that year, men broke into John's room at the convent, abducted him, and led him, bound and blindfolded, to a monastery in Toledo. When John refused to renounce his work with Teresa of Avila, he was beaten and thrown into monastery prison, where he survived on little more than bread and water. After 2 months, he was placed in solitary confinement, where the only light he saw came through a slit in his prison wall. Now, this is ironic, to punish a priest in this way whose only desire was to love God, to practice his faith with utmost simplicity, in isolation, without earthly trappings at all. And so it was there in that cell he began to compose his greatest work, first by memorizing the words in the dark, and later with the help of a kind jailer, writing them down. And he escaped finally. After 9 months, he fled to the south of Spain, continued to write down what he had learned in the dark. And most people who hear the name of John's best-known work assume that it is the memoir of a survivor describing the worst period of his life, because so many people have been programmed to think of dark as a synonym for sinister. It's a whole nother topic. But many people will open The Dark Night of the Soul expecting John to tell them how awful it was and how he got through it by hanging on to his faith in God no matter what happened to him. Well, those readers will be disappointed, I'm afraid. One of the central features of the dark night, he says, is to convince those who grasp after things that God cannot be grasped. In John's native Spanish, his word for God is nada. God is no thing, not a thing to be held on to. God can only be encountered like an event. Though the dark night of the soul typically refers to the individual's experience, it is also true that whole communities can lose sight of the sun for a time. I think John of the Cross wants to say to us that the dark night is a gift to you, intended for your liberation. It is about freeing you from your ideas about God, or your fears about faith or religion, or your attachments to God, or positive or negative evaluations about God, or about yourself as a believer, as though there should be a cure for your doubts without love for your doubts. No, the only thing required in the dark night is to stay in it, to stay present and awake to it, not to be too quick to turn on the lights, but to stay in it long enough to be led towards something else, some deeper wisdom you could never have uncovered in the light of day. Yes, I too resonate with democracy grief. I too am struggling with the loss of the idealism of the Obama years, that hope and change thing that we were promised. But I assure you, something else is happening now. Something else is taking shape. Maybe when the moon of our democratic ideals is but a tiny crescent far away from us, maybe this is what it takes for new generations to become mobilized in entirely new ways. Perhaps, and I do not say this lightly, knowing that it will mean death and destruction on a mass scale, but perhaps it must become worse before it gets better. For the children who have enjoyed a steady forecast of relative sunshine to realize their place in their own democratic process and act on it. What I do know is that darkness and light are not on opposite poles of our lives, though we may think of them that way. Emotionally, we know that joy touches sadness, and courage touches fear. We can feel like the light is very far away, experience that as a spelunking expedition into the cavern of our souls. But if that is our only focus, to get back to the light, then we will miss the gift that only comes to us in darkness. That trust walk on the mountain under the night sky so many years ago was notable for two major features. First, there was no turning back. How could I? I would lose all face. I would lose my sense of myself as a truth or dare player who always chose dare. My propensity towards risk rather than certainty. I would lead us all back into the light, and the light would take on a new tone. Disappointment would flood us under the cabin's fluorescent glare. No, there was no going back. And of course, the other major feature is that feeling my way through the dark, there was a hand in mine. She didn't know where she was going either. It's good to learn that kind of trust early. I still have it. That is my belief system. I still trust that wherever we are going as a country, wherever we are going as a religious community, we are going there together. Some of us may be shuffling. Others may be weary, ready to turn back, barely moving for fear of what is to come. And some of us are walking sure-footed with certainty. Well, welcome to winter. Welcome to long nights and gray days. This is the time to reach out a hand, to find someone who can lead you forward, whispering in your ear, now step up, now step down. Feel the warmth of connection, reminding you that in community, we need not resist darkness. Instead, we shall face the dark together. As the poet says, tonight, as it gets cold, tell yourself what you know, which is nothing but the tune your bones play as you keep going. And you will be able, for once, to lie down under the small fire of winter stars. And if it happens that you cannot go on or turn back, and you find yourself where you will be at the end, tell yourself, in that final flowing of cold through your limbs, that you love what you are. Amen. Blessed be.